who am I recording for? Charlie, maybe one or two other folks. All right. Welcome back, everybody. Welcome back. Death and Dying in the Dharma, Part 2. I'm going to start this afternoon with just a couple of quick stories that come to mind. These are stories, favorite stories of mine, actually, about death and dying. Pai Chang is a Layman Pang, is his name. Layman Pang? Yeah, just like I saw the name. Layman Pang is a famous character in the Zen tradition. At some point, he just decided he'd had enough of material things. He was a householder, married with a daughter. So he just put all the stuff on a boat, pushed it out into the middle of a pond and sank it. And then he and his wife and his daughter wandered around all over the place, and they became quite famous. And there are lots of lovely stories told about them. At some point, when his daughter was all grown up and saving China, and his wife had passed away, Layman Pang thought it was time for him to shuffle off this mortal coil. So he told his daughter to just mind stuff, and they were in a little hut in the middle of nowhere. Told her that he was about to sit in the corner and he was just going to pass away because it was his time. So she said, "Okay, Dad." Let him sit down, and she opened her. She said, "Oh my goodness, look at the moon!" So Layman Pang got up to step outside and look at the moon. And when he came back in, his daughter was sitting on the meditation cushion, dead. He said, "Oh, she's done it again. She's got ahead of me once again." It's just a beautiful relationship with death. Just a beautiful relationship with death, not taking it too seriously, right? Swami Vivekananda, who was a disciple of Sri Ramakrishna. Vivekananda was the guy who came across in the 1892 Parliament of the World's Religions, first of the parliaments, and he was the rock star. He became famous, and it was the first time that Buddhism came across to America in a way that was accessible to most Americans. I mean, Chinese immigrants brought Buddhism across when they came across another tradition. But it's the first time it really became accessible. Vivekananda came across, and the whole Vedanta movement, there's a Vedanta center here in town, really came out of Vivekananda. He did a ton of really amazing things. At one point, he realized it was his time to go. So he said to his disciples, "Okay, you all hang out here for a little bit. You can come and look for me in 4 hours." So he went into the meditation room and he sat. 4 hours later, they went in to get him on his cushion, dead. It was his time. This is beautiful. And it's not that this is taking life frivolously. It's not throwing our life away for no particular reason. But it's recognizing the impermanence of life. And then when it's our time to go, it's simply our time to go. Rather more dramatically, Thich Quang Duc, who was a Vietnam monastic, it was during the time of the Vietnam War, which in Vietnam was called the American War, for obvious reasons. He was just, as were so many of the monks, and Thich Nhat Hanh was there with them at the time, and there were so many of them having such a hard time, because the monastic, the Buddhist, the official Buddhist tradition in Vietnam was just being utterly useless in the war. No, they were taking sides, and it was just really unhelpful. And it's like, what do we do? How can we bring? And the world was not paying attention, and this country was doing what it was doing. And he came to this really difficult decision. He said, the only way I can think of to bring attention to this is to self-immolate. And so he did. And you've all seen the pictures. Thich Quang Duc sat in the middle of the marketplace, poured gasoline over himself, set fire to it, and there he sits. And so this is using this life in a completely different way. And it's a way that none of us would, most of us, could say none of us, we wouldn't think of doing that. My goodness, how could I do that? But it's because he thought, what is the most useful thing I can do with this life? And looking at him sitting there in the pictures, unaffected by the fire, just raging over his body, you get a sense that this is a person, this was a life that was not attached to this physical form. It wasn't impacted by the pain going on at these sense gates. There was separation there. The skandhas are 5 heaps that if you look at how they relate to each other, they really don't. They're 5 heaps. This is all utterly fascinating stuff when you really slow down and get close to looking at it. The last story I'll tell you, lot more light-hearted. Thoreau, Walden Pond and all that. He was lying on his deathbed, and I think it was an aunt of his. Asked him if he'd made his peace with God. About his time, it was late on in his life, and he was about to go. Have you made peace with God? And Thoreau looked at her and said, I wasn't aware we'd ever quarrelled. So we have death is a friend. Death really is, as the Toltecs would have it. Death is right there with us. Right there with us all the time. And you just look around. Ah, there you are. Really nice to remember it. And it shifts, having death as a friend and changing our relationship with death shifts our relationship with life. So familiarizing ourselves with death is a really useful thing. I'm going to talk now about the Giramananda Sutta, let's put it very fast, which is one of those 3 sutras of healing and protection that I talked about at the beginning. And in this one, the individual who is sick, called Giramananda, not surprisingly, is noticed by Ananda, who goes to see the boss, and he says, hey, Buddha, Giramananda's sick. Could you kind of go and help him? Go talk to him, go see if you can do anything? I think what we need to do here, Ananda, is why don't you go talk to him? And I think if you were, and this is what it says, if you were to recite to the mendicant Giramananda these 10 perceptions, it's possible that after hearing them, his illness will die down on the spot. And I wrote that down because the phrase, recite to the mendicant Giramananda these 10 perceptions. These are 10 perceptions. So I want to talk about these 10 perceptions. I'm going to start by talking about perception. What is perception? Well, perception is, we talked about it earlier, the 5 aggregates. It's the third of the 5 aggregates. It's a mental state, and it's what we do with the feeling tones. There's eye contact, orange, red, brown, white. These are all perceptions. They're not real. These are perceptions. We make the world up with perceptions. And then we build on top of the perceptions, and we build all these fabrications. But we don't recognize most of the time the extent to which our world is a world of perceptions. And this is what Elizabeth, who's still with us, I thought you were going to be on a hidden screen, Elizabeth. What Elizabeth was talking about earlier with the story of Bahia.
I did. I said.
Oh, she's done it. Success. Yay.
Yeah, sorry.
So Bahia was told, when there is seeing, there is just seeing. That's it. There is no perception. There's no orange. There's no red. What else do I say? More than colors, but there's no perception. When there's touching, there's just touching. There's no warm. There's no cold. There's no prickly. There's just touch. No stories. The rest is just perception. And this is said about each of the aggregates in turn in different places, but it's a problem we get into. And if you think about it, this is what we're doing all the time. And the challenge is often, which of these are we actually doing? we can see perception as self. We absolutely identify with our perception. I perceive a body. We see perception as self. We see self as possessing perception. Bell, mine. We see self as in the perception, or perception as in the self. Same happens with feelings and form and fabrications of consciousness. But it's this, we see a relationship between an I and this aggregate. And it's a confused relationship. We don't really investigate the nature of it. Am I seeing myself as identified with, or as possessing, or as in, or as it in me? You actually slow down and try and look at that. We don't know because we haven't really looked at it. We woke up this morning from our sleep, and we woke up from a dream. Probably all of us dream. Hopefully some of us can remember the dreams. Most of the time I don't remember my dreams, but some of us hopefully can. And in that dream, typically what happens in a dream is there's a me running around in the dream doing stuff. If you slow down and think about it, so how is there a me in my dream and other people and other things in my dream? That doesn't make any sense. But it's what happens, and we kind of accept it. But we also accept that that's all me in my dream. Right? All those other people are just my subconscious personified. So we wake up from that and we come here, and I look around here and I see a Natalie and a Patricia and an Andrew and a me. It's the same, folks. It's just the same. These separations are all perceptions. Because there's just contact. If you deal with this Bahia thing, there's just contact. These are all perceptions. It's not saying it's not happening. It's not saying none of this is happening. But what it is saying is the way we assemble this is through these constructs of perceptions, and these create problems because they create this sense of identity, this sense of separation, out of which all of this massive dukkha arises. So I'll just jump. That, by the way, is nothing like what I intended to say. So we will. No, something else I do need to say before I get into the sutta. So the Buddha's first teaching, which I mentioned earlier, was the Four Noble Truths. And it was the one where he said, avoiding these two extremes, the Buddha teaches the middle way. And the middle way is the truth of suffering, the cause of suffering, that there is an end and the way to end it. Right? But then he also said, there are three turnings of the wheel. The first turning of the wheel is seeing these truths. The second turning of the wheel is applying ourselves to the duty associated with each of those four limbs. So the truth of suffering must be understood. Must be understood. The cause of suffering must be abandoned. The end of suffering must be realized. And the path to the end of suffering must be developed. And I think he actually said fully understood, fully abandoned, fully realized, and fully developed. So these are tasks. This is not just an abstract list of, oh, I understand the list. This is, okay, now I've got to do the work. I've actually got to get engaged and do the work. And that's what we come here to do. That's what we sit on our cushions to do. To do the work of maturing these four truths. And the third turning of the wheel, the truth of suffering has been fully understood. If the truth of suffering has been fully understood, we have completely seen through impermanence. It cannot fool us anymore. If the cause of suffering has been fully abandoned, then at the sense gates, there is only contact. There is only seeing, there is only hearing. There is no clinging, there's nothing to cling to. It's been completely abandoned. The end of suffering has been fully realized. It's done. The holy life has been lived. I've done what had to be done. This is the last birth. There is no more becoming. Done. It's been fully realized. And the path has been fully developed. I built the raft, used the raft to cross to the other shore, got to the other shore, stepped off the raft and left the raft behind. Fully developed. So again, this is, I talked about it, Elizabeth talked about it. This is a graduated path. It's a path which one can evolve along. There are ways of learning our way through this path and practicing through this path as we increase in our understanding, as we increase in the extent of our abandonment and the depth of our abandonment, and as our realization becomes more mature, and as our development of the path grows stronger and clearer. So, Buddha gave Ananda 10 perceptions to go talk to Giramananda about. Those 10 perceptions I am going to look at in terms of those 4 tasks. So the first one is the task of understanding suffering. The first perception is the perception of impermanence. And in the sutta, the Buddha says to Ananda, so if you were to talk to him about these 10 perceptions, maybe his illness will subside right there. So what is, the first one's impermanence, what is the perception of impermanence? It is when a mendicant, and then he says, observes or examines or meditates on, there's an engagement with. The perception is this observation, this examination, or this meditation on. So impermanence isn't just a thing. It's, in this sense, it's the perception of impermanence. It's what we do with it, how we engage with it. Impermanence is a perception. Actually, we think of the 3 characteristics of anicca, dukkha, and anatta, impermanence. I was trying to think of another translation and it's gone. Impermanence, then stress, unsatisfactoriness, suffering, and not self. But the Buddha didn't actually talk about them as the 3 characteristics. He talked about them as the 3 perceptions, because they are perceptions. And if our perception is distorted, as it is most of the time, if our perception is distorted, then we see what is impermanent as permanent. We take what is impermanent to be permanent. It doesn't occur to me most of the time that this sack of skin and bones is getting old. It doesn't occur to me that my hair isn't the same color as it was when I was in my teens. Don't notice these things because I just see this as static. I see it as permanent. This is distorted perception, and it's mistaking the perception of impermanence. We mistake what is unpleasurable and causes dukkha for something that will make us happy and cause us pleasure. Ice cream, right? We mistake it. It's not going to make me happy. The taste is fine. I mean, there's nothing wrong with eating a bowl of ice cream, but the relationship with that bowl of ice cream is generally, that was really good, let me get some more. Oh no, I've left it too long, it started to melt. Oh my goodness, I ate too much, I just put on 3 pounds. The relationship is one which doesn't bring us pleasure, it causes dukkha. So distorted perception sees that which is dukkha as that which will cause pleasure. And mistaken perception sees that which is not self as self. Impermanence is one of those perceptions. I'm going to couple this with the third one, actually. The third one is impurities. Now, impurities is actually the body parts. The reason it's called impurities, in the canon there is a list of 32 body parts. And it's hair of the head, hair of the body, teeth, skin, nails. Those are the first 5. And then it goes on into like lungs, heart, spleen, liver, and then it gets into all the juices like blood and pus and urine and so forth. So you've got things in there that are solid, things that are liquid. And these body parts, when we look at the body parts, what we're doing is another way of really looking at the body in the same way as we look at the 5 aggregates. The body parts, these 32 body parts, are just seeing the body as 32 heaps. There's actually one of the sutras in which Buddha talks about it's just like the carcass of a cow. Imagine a skilled butcher getting with a cow, and he peels the skin off, and then he gets inside, he or she gets inside and cuts all the muscles away from the bones, cuts all the tendons and ligaments, and then just reassembles it all. It just looks like it always did. Only nothing's attached. And that's kind of what we're talking about here. If we look at the body parts in this way, we can see everything. It's like these separate things. It's not this integrated whole. It's a bunch of stuff. And we look at this and we think, this is beautiful. Let me dye my hair. Let me lose a few pounds. Let me cut my fingernails. Let me get a new suit. But if we start to look at the hair of the head and we realize, I've not got as much as I used to. It's a different color. We start really looking at these body parts and just seeing the body parts. We see that what we take as beautiful really isn't. And people can get carried away with this and talk about the ugly and so forth. But that's not what it's about. It's about not getting stuck on what we think is beautiful. So bringing these two together, impermanence and the impurities, the body parts. Little story. Maybe 6 months ago, I had a big swelling in my gum in here. I realized it was an abscess. It wasn't hurting, so it was fine. So I left this big lump there. And over time, it faded away, and there was a little lump there, and the little lump was still there a short while ago. And so I realized there was still some residue of the abscess. And what I hadn't really connected was this particular tooth has a root canal. So the fact that I couldn't feel anything really didn't mean anything because the nerves were already dead. So there was an abscess. So I went to my dentist for a checkup, and he looked at it, and I asked him about it. He said, so I think it's probably cured, but it's probably healed itself, but there's still this little thing there. He looked at it, he said, you need to have that pulled, because no, it's not. I mean, what's happened is it's found a way to drain, but you've still got an active abscess there that's just draining, and it's draining into your blood, and it's eating away at your jaw. Look at the x-ray. There's like, less bone there than there should be. So you need to get that pulled. So I had it pulled on Monday. It was hilarious, actually. The dentist didn't know what to make of it because he had me sitting in the chair. He jabbed me with the big heavy Novocaine needle a couple of times. And so he got his scalpel out and cut the gum away a little bit. And then he reached in there with his pliers and started trying to pull it out, and it wouldn't come out. And I just started laughing. And he said, stop it, you're making me laugh. So he got out his really big pliers and he pulled, and then you could hear this big crunch as the crown that was on top of this root canal tooth crumbled, and so he had to grab the piece of side and he pulled it out. And they wanted me to take painkillers and whatever, and I wasn't going to do that. I mean, if it got really horrible, of course I was. It's like, I want to know what this feels like. It was really interesting. Actually, really interesting. It was, when the Novocaine wore off, it was painful for a short while, but it was only a short while, and then it kind of normalized, and now there's just a hole there. But this is just, and now I've got the decision, right, of whether I mean, I'll go back and have a look at it again in another week or two, and presumably say that's all fine, and I'll take out whatever stitches are remaining. And then in 3 months, I get to go back and have him drill a big fat hole in there and put a post in it, and we go back 3 months later and have an artificial tooth put on top. It costs like $5,000 or $6,000. Am I going to do this? I got 3 months to figure it out. Really interesting. I mean, I'm 60 years old. Do I care about having another tooth back there for the rest of my life? I don't know. This is an exercise in impermanence. And it's impermanence directly applied at the body in every sense, right? I've been walking around for I don't know how many years, at least 10 years, with a crown here, thinking it was a tooth. It wasn't a tooth, it was a crown. It was, but what's really going on here? And then I have this episode where this tooth is yanked out. And so in that moment, it's catastrophic. There's this great cavity there. Oh my God, he stuffed it with all these bits of chipped stuff and sewn it all up. But it feels so deep. There's no way that's the height of the rest of the gum. Well, a couple of hours later, of course it is. Perception. Just perception. And if I do have that extra tooth put back in, yeah, it'll make my grinding of food in the back of my mouth like it always has been. But if I don't, how long will it take me before I don't even notice? A week? Perception, impermanence and perception. So talk to Gitamananda about impermanence. Talk to him about the impurities. Gitamananda is sick. Illness, in an important sense, is a gift. We don't think of it in these terms. Illness is a gift. Pain is a gift. Not illness, but pain is a gift. With pain, try not being present when there's pain. Try not being mindful when there's pain. It brings us here, brings us present. It slows time down. Got a toothache. It will never end. Slows time down. Really does. Experientially, it really does. So Gitamananda is in that place where he is really receptive. Emotionally and physically, he's really receptive to these teachings. And he receives this teaching about impermanence. And he receives about the perception of impermanence. He receives this teaching about the perception of impurities of the body as parts. And they kind of land. And he receives the second of these teachings, the second of the perceptions, is selflessness, non-self. With given impermanence, how can there be anything to hold on to? Given impermanence, how can there be anything here of which I can say, this is me, this is myself, this is mine, this is what I am? There can't be. There simply can't be. If we see the truth of impermanence and the perception of impermanence, purify that perception, so it's a clean perception of impermanence, there cannot be a self. So there cannot be anything of which we can conceive this perception of a self. Because again, it's perceptions all the way down. Elephants, turtles, perceptions all the way down. Gitamananda receives that teaching too. And then the fourth of these, which is in the category of understanding, is the dangers. Dangers are diseases. And if you were to read the sutta, Elizabeth's just got my notes up there, but if you were to read the sutta, what you'll see in this section, much like there's that list of 32 body parts, there's this whole long list of different diseases. Diseases of the blood, diseases of the skin, diseases of the bones, just this whole long list of diseases. And what that's about is it's reminding Gitamananda, and by reading and talking about it, reminding us that we are going to get sick. The very nature of this thing that I call my body is its predisposition to being sick, to experiencing illness, to experiencing age, to experiencing suffering and pain. It's its very nature. Just got a little piece of grit in my mouth there. This hole was packed with little bits of grit, with the idea that it would form bone. And every now and again, a little piece of grit comes out. Impermanence, don't you know? So this is a reminder that the perception of this body that we generally have is a flawed perception. It is a distorted perception because we fail to bring into that perception the reality that this thing we're walking around with is constantly at risk, danger, getting sick. And if we can stay close to that, we'll start shifting the perspective, the perception, to a more realistic perception, to a purified or a cleansed perception. So these are 4 perceptions that are presented to Giramananda with the invitation for him to explore and investigate with a view to understanding suffering, understanding dukkha. So the next one, 5th one, abandoning arisen sensual thought, ill will, the thought of harming, and bad, unwholesome states. The causes of suffering must be fully abandoned. Having understood suffering, we must now abandon the causes. So Giramananda, with this perception, is being invited to, okay, you get all this, now start letting go, abandon this stuff. And we talk of the root of our problems is ignorance. And fundamentally, the ignorance is ignorance of the 4 Noble Truths. Most human beings walk around without understanding the truth of suffering at all. And the first problem is that ignorance. Once we overcome that ignorance, we can get onto the path to happiness, to release. That ignorance is not passive. It's not something that happens by accident. That ignorance is something that we do. It's an act. That ignorance is creating clouds on that which is without clouds. It's like with, the meditation this morning, mind like sky, whatever. It's like, you're seeing stuff come up that's obstructing that native calm, that native peace, that's obstructing as clouds obstruct the clear blue sky that is always there. Clouds aren't passive, they're active, they form. These thoughts, these mental obstructions, these physical things that turn into mental stories, these are active. In the same way, abandoning is active. And there's a perceiving, there's a perception that comes together around the act of abandoning. And we look at that act of abandoning. And it's to be done skillfully. It's to be done as a gentle act of letting go. Not a forceful thing that creates another problem because you're forcing and creating another kind of clinging. So then we move on to the 6th is dispassion. And I will read a quote here for you. Having gone into the forest to the root of a tree or to an empty hut, a bhikkhu reflects, this is peaceful, this is sublime. That is the stilling of activities, the relinquishment of all acquisitions, the destruction of craving, dispassion, nibbana. That guided meditation this morning, what I hope you experienced just a little bit of in that meditation, was seeing the perception of breath, the stress, actually, of breath arising and subsiding out of peace, out of this is peaceful, This is sublime. Because our breath too is a fabrication. We talk about following the breath. We're not following the breath. We're following the perception of breath. Think about it. You can't really be following the breath because what's following what? It's a perception. And that's okay. That is really cool. But it's a perception. So I hope what you experienced a little bit of this morning was those perceptions of breath arising, breath subsiding, coming out of that peace, that sublimity. And every now and again, we probably all found a little bit of pain in the leg, airplane flying past, a little bit of random thought about what you're doing tonight, and what you didn't do before you left this morning. All this stuff coming up out of this peace. But seeing it come out of that peace and subside back into that peace, and knowing that that peace is there, and knowing of that peace, this is peaceful, this is sublime, that is the stilling of activities, the relinquishment of all acquisitions, the destruction of craving, dispassion, nirvana. Because that's it. This is peace. This is how we let go. This is how we recognize there's nothing to be afraid of. Stuff comes, stuff goes. The peace is always there. In fact, the peace always is wrong as well, because that peace is outside time and space. It's just peace. So this dispassion, the Pali word for dispassion is nibbida, and it is often translated as revulsion as well. And it's to do with seeing through these illusions, seeing through the illusions. The next one, cessation. Cessation is the sutta uses exactly the same quote. This is peaceful, this is sublime. Cessation is a coming to an end. Cessation is just a stopping. So now we're on to the third category, which is realization. We've done the first one, which is understanding truth, understanding suffering. We've abandoned it. And by working on that one properly, we have fully abandoned. And now we're moving on to fully realizing. And fully realizing the end of suffering, fully realizing the end of dukkha and release. Cessation. It stops. We clearly see the end of suffering. We clearly see impermanence. We clearly and intentionally stop engaging. And what happens at this point, if you think about this, it sounds extreme. It sounds extreme, and I'm not asking everybody to, oh yeah, I think I'll try that, because you can't and you won't. But if you think about it, if you reach a place of complete dispassion, completely seeing through, completely recognizing the unsatisfactory nature of all sense pleasures, they have no interest for you anymore. So the senses kind of stop functioning, at least at that intellectual level, at least at that level of where you start experiencing stuff. The body's still walking around, it's still doing things. You still eat, you still walk. But that sensory experience is just not interesting, and it just comes to an end. It ceases. Because this peace, it's the peace of God which passeth all understanding, right? This peace is so sweet, so beautiful. It is complete release. That's where this is going. And again, Girananda is in a place where he's really receptive to this. So he's moving down the path to, okay, so now I've abandoned, and now we're getting into this release thing. Cessation. We clearly see non-self, This also brings to mind. It goes back to Bahia again. When I forget the word in the translation Elizabeth used, but it wasn't the word I'm going to use. The word was when there is seeing, there is only seeing, or something like that. So a translation I've seen and I use is when there is seeing, there is just seeing. When there's hearing, there is just hearing. Those of you who are familiar with Zen practice will be familiar with the phrase just sitting. It is the same just. There's no me in there. It's not just sit, Gareth. It's just sit. There's just sitting. There's no Gareth sitting. There's just sitting. There's no experience of sitting. There's just sitting. There's no perception of it sitting. There's just sitting. And it's subtle because this is not nihilistic. This is not pushing us to the extreme of self-mortification. The extremes of self-gratification, self-mortification, also talked about as the extreme of existence and non-existence. It's not pushing us to that extreme of self-mortification or non-existence. It's taking this middle path and saying, there is still sitting, and it's beautiful, and it's wonderful. It's just wonderful. And it can be so useful because there is so much suffering in the world, and there is so much that can be done to relieve suffering. So it's so beautiful. But when you cut through it all, there is just sitting, and there's nobody to get attached to this false perception that can arise. So the eighth, no delight in the whole world. I've kind of talked through this a little bit. If you see through all this stuff, it just isn't interesting. It's not that it's not interesting. It's interesting in a completely different way. It's the bowl of ice cream. Ice cream is just, why would I bother eating this stuff? I eat, we reflect on the effort that brought us this food and consider how it comes to us. We reflect on our virtue and practice and whether we are worthy of this offering. We regard greed as, we reflect on our virtue and practice and whether we are worthy of this offering. We regard greed as the obstacle to freedom of mind. We regard this meal as medicine to sustain this life. That's what the food's about. The food's not, oh, this is really tasty, thank you. Is it good for this body? Is it allowing this body to live a useful life? So, it's not saying pleasure is gone. Quite the opposite. It's saying there is no delight in the world. This world doesn't excite this. Because the excitement of this is precisely what can only lead to disappointment in the world, and therefore to the kind of suffering and fear we're talking about experiencing as we approach death. So this is about seeing clearly through the illusions that we think make our life worthwhile, and they really don't. The illusions that give these temporary experiences of happiness, but the happiness is not pleasure. The happiness is sensory stimulation. And that sensory stimulation has to either get greater or less. And whatever direction it goes in, it's impermanent. It's going to be suffering. Letting that go and moving instead to this much more subtle piece. And when Elizabeth was reading what Buddha was going through in his last minutes, hours, however long that took, when he was running up and down the jhanas, jhanas are also not special. I mean, in a sense, they really are, but in an important sense, they're not special. If you sit and you meditate and you build concentration in your meditation, they just naturally happen. What happens naturally as you meditate become more stable, as things become really quiet. And then physical pleasure, physical joy just naturally starts arising. It's all this. It can be really exciting and it can be overwhelming at times. But underneath that overwhelming, there's just that peace that I hope you all touched into this morning. And I hope you touched into it in the meditation. Elizabeth left you with as well. Just that peace, that stillness. And as we settle further, the voices stop. The stories just naturally come to an end. The mind just stops talking. Because the system just starts settling in on this peace as being superior. And the progression of the jhanas just keeps moving through that into this deeper and deeper and more stable peace. And it is a peace that is not dependent on anything. Because it is unconditioned. Unlike everything, which is conditioned, it is unconditioned. It's just peace. And it is a peace that does no harm anywhere in the world. Any other pleasure you find, there's a downside to it somewhere. There's going to be a harm somewhere. There's a cost. Even if the cost is that it eventually unravels and the unraveling leads to dukkha. There's a cost. This peace, there is no cost. Just peace. So this practice is, and this is where the graduated practice is really helpful, because I've jumped right into a deep end here, and it's like, wow, this is way too much fun. But if we step back from that, if what I'm saying makes computational sense, because we're still here with our little bodies and our little minds doing all this stuff, if it makes sense, then you say, okay. The Ajahn Chah quote. If I let go a little bit, I'll have a little bit of peace. Let me at least do that. And let me see if I can let go a little bit more. And maybe one day I'll be able to let go a lot, and I'll get a lot of peace. And the more we let go and the more peace we find, the better equipped we are to deal with the difficulties of what we think of as this life, but the ultimate one, of course, being death. So, number 8, non-delight in the whole world. It's realizing that worldly pleasures really aren't pleasurable in the most meaningful sense, and setting those aside and instead moving into this unworldly pleasure of this peace that is available to us as we let go of things, as we let go of ourselves. Number 9, impermanence with regard to all mental formations. Well, it's all mental formations. Well, it is all mental formations, period. There's not much else. So we're now in the developing the path, right? So we've realized, and the last one is develop path. Oh no, I'm not. I'm on number 9, number 10. I'm sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. So number 9 is really just an extension of number 8. So we'll not say any more about that. I will jump to number 10. Number 10 is mindfulness of breathing. Breathing's a fabrication, right? Didn't you just say that? So what's mindfulness of breathing doing? But this is exactly what Buddha did on his deathbed. The jhanas, you follow the breath and you see where, and you let that take you where it takes you, and it takes you into these deep places. And being mindful of the breath is precisely where our practice goes. And if we come inward and we settle in on the breath, that is the place where all of our fabrications start. All of our fabrications start with breath. And it's the place where we can start to unpack and undo all of our fabrications. And actually what he goes through there is what in other parts of the canon is called the Anapanasati Sutta, which is the teaching of in-breath and out-breath, in-breathing and out-breathing. And there are 4 sections. Well, it's actually a very sophisticated sutra. And I just talk about it very briefly, and I would encourage you to explore it if you're remotely interested in this, because it really is amazing. It starts off breathing in long. I'm aware I'm breathing in long. Breathing out long, I'm aware I'm breathing out long. Breathing in long, short, I'm breathing out short. So there's an awareness of breath, and there's just following the breath. Just noticing the quality of the breath, whether it's long, whether it's short, whether it's deep, whether it's shallow, whether it's harsh, whether it's gentle. It's just an awareness of what's going on, the quality of the breath. And then from that awareness of breath, we move into breathing in. I forget the third one. I'm aware of the body. Breathing in, I'm aware of the body. So there's the breathing is then the foundation for the action. Breathing in, I'm aware of all bodies. Breathing out, I calm all bodies. So they all have this flow from there on, where the breathing is the foundation for the work within meditation. So it's very active work. And it breaks down into 4 chunks, where the first chunk is mindfulness of the body. The second is mindfulness of the feelings, or of perceptions and feelings, depending on how you want to look at it. So if the Chitta Shankara, which is the mental formations, mind fabrications. The third one is of Chitta, mind itself. And the fourth one is some of the list here. It's of impermanence, of dispassion, of letting go. So it's a practice that Giramananda was given as the last of the 10 perceptions. This is the perception, Giramananda, that if you use this perception right now, it will help you get better. So this perception is precisely the perception that is used to develop practice. I'm going to just describe it as a practice development thing. So Giramananda was taught through these perceptions, through the Four Noble Truths, that really understand suffering. And we understand it by understanding the absolute pervasiveness of impermanence. That there is not a thing here that can be held on to. And that any perception we create that there's something we can hold on to is going to cause us a problem. Really understand that as a result of that, there is no thing called a self. Not really. It can be useful. It can be very useful. But just it's like sensuality. Nothing wrong with sensuality. If you truly can just eat a bowl of ice cream and then put it down and forget about it, that's great. Kind of hard to do because it's got these springs, and we anticipate the bowl of ice cream and then we think about it afterwards. So really understanding selflessness, and then moving into really abandoning the causes. If we recognize the truth of suffering, then we have to work on abandoning the causes, really putting aside those things that are going to get us into trouble. And the third, as a result of this work, we then start to actually realize, directly realize, as Bahia did, directly realize the end of sukha, the end of suffering. And to do all of that, we need to develop the path. And the path is normally articulated as the Noble Eightfold Path. Here it's really articulated as mindfulness and breathing, the Anapanasati teachings, which serve the same purpose. So with that, I started this off in a place where I wasn't going to start it off, which I think actually I'm glad I did, because I'm sure this was a lot better than what I had planned to do. And I'm going to go to a place that I hadn't planned to go here as well, because we're now going to sit and meditate for a little while, for about 30 minutes. What I had planned to do was a guided meditation through the Anapanasati Sutta. But I think instead, we're going to do a Brahmavihara metta meditation. For those who aren't familiar with it, whenever the Buddha taught the whenever the Buddha taught the jhanas, which are these settlings, and he would regularly talk about how concentration is really about navigating into these jhana states, because these are what happens to the mind as it starts getting settled. He routinely would go through the 4 form-based jhanas, and then he would articulate the 4 Brahma Viharas as boundless radiations, and they are metta, which is kindness or goodwill towards all beings, self and all beings. Upekkha, which is compassion for all beings, for self and all beings. Metta is wanting all beings to be happy. Compassion is simply what metta looks like when it encounters dukkha. If somebody's suffering, you want them to get better. They've got to get better for them to be happy. So it's just wanting them to be happy. Mudita is sympathetic joy, which is what metta looks like when it encounters somebody who's happy. What metta looks like when it encounters joy. Oh, I'm so glad you're happy. Please stay happy. And that makes me happy. And equanimity is the stability to just deal with difficulties that are out of control. So if you've got somebody who's sick or dying and there's not much you can do, the best thing you can do with them for that person is often to sit with them and just be an island of peace. This is what compassion, this is what metta looks like when it's in that very difficult place of potential overwhelm. It's equanimity. So the Buddha would, after the jhanas, he would talk about the 4 Brahma Viharas, and he'd talk about them as radiating in all directions. And the teaching fundamentally is, this is no different than the jhanas. This too is a deep contemplation. This too is a deep practice that can take us to this place, that can take us all the way to complete peace and to complete liberation. So, if you will settle in, we will sit for, where are we?
Gareth?
Yes, Elizabeth.
We are well off our schedule, but we can.
Oh my goodness, I talked for an hour, not 30 minutes, didn't I? What am I doing?
But that's okay. So what we could do, if we do 30 minutes on this, because this is actually, I think, very helpful, the metta practice. So do this for 30 minutes, and then I'll shorten the mantra period. So
I'll do this. Let me do this for.
So that's okay.
We'll do this for just a shade under 20 minutes, Elizabeth.
Or we'll say 20.
We'll do 20.
Yeah.
We'll do 20 minutes.
Okay. And then I'll shorten mine too, so we have enough time for questions,
Well,
just in case, and discussion.
Yeah, thank you for catching me. I was getting confused. I did. I took way too long.
We're just having so much fun.
We are, yeah. All right. I'm going to stop recording.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right. And then, so if you'll settle in.